This is the Content Strategy Insights Podcast, episode number 204. The internet has made the world a lot smaller, and some aspects of communicating online lend themselves to one-size-fits-all, globalized content. But product and content designers still need to serve the needs of local populations, and sometimes these groups can have very specific needs. At Google, Stephanie Pereira works on hyper-localized content, balancing a mix of challenging internal product demands with a rich variety of external cultural concerns.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights Podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 204 of the Content Strategy Insights Podcast. I am really delighted today to welcome to the show Stephanie Pereira. Stephanie is a content design manager at Google Pay. She's based in Singapore. And welcome to the show, Stephanie. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you're up to these days.
Thank you for having me. So I work on payments. I'm based in Singapore, as you just mentioned. A lot of the work I do is hyper-localized in the sense that we work on very specific markets. And that's sort of given me the opportunity to think about, how we write for different people, what their mental model is in a lot of these different places, what their relationship, because I work in payments, especially like how that, their relationship with money, how that translates to language as well. It's been a very fun journey.
Yeah, and language. I've had a few people on like from the financial industry world, and money stuff is notoriously fraught. So that kind of adds a whole accountability level to your job, I'm imagining. And but it's also like for the individual end user, it's really important to understand specifically what's going on and how to complete that transaction you're in the middle of. Can you give an example of because I think a lot of people think, oh, okay, I'm going to do my product in India. I'll just translate it. I'll just do Hindi and English and we'll be good to go. Tell me why that's a dumb idea.
I might have like a specific example here. I think I've worked on screens where we've had a lot of language, and a few years ago we had one of these screens where we wanted to do it globally. It's a lot of language. What we tried to do was maybe simplify some of the language, like use simpler words, use shorter phrases, use things like that. And one of the things we realized was just the sheer amount of content, even when the language itself was simpler, it just gave people pause. It made people feel anxious. It made people feel like, what, this entire product is just too hard for me. Maybe, I'm not confident. I don't know how to use this. And these were people who'd been using the product every day. But at this point, they were just like, yep, I'm out. This is too hard for me. So I think it's also just, recognizing that sometimes that translation is not just, hey, we translated it. That's the extent of it. It's also recognizing that the feature itself might need to be shown or contextualized or changed in a way to suit the market, because what works in one place, for example, if for example this were a privacy screen in some markets, that longer language would be comforting, like, hey, we're being very transparent. But in some markets, this just feels overwhelming. So that's sort of that, I guess, the nuance, one of the nuances, we had in these markets.
That's really interesting to me, because that you just described a conversation. You have to go back to the product manager and just go, hey, this isn't working over here. Do you have a lot of conversations like that? Or tell me, do you collaborate differently? I don't know how many other content design roles you've had, but that sounds like a unique kind of leverage point to influence the product itself.
I think because I work in payments, the more difficult conversation sometimes to have is with legal, because there's a lot of language that we have to have. But something, I think a couple of years ago I was working on something where I think one of our legal partners said something that just really resonated with me as a UX writer. She said, hey, if people can't even understand this, what are we doing? So, like how we can't ask people to consent to something that they don't even understand. So it is our job to make things a lot easier. It is our job to sort of like surface things in a way that makes sense, in a way that, makes people feel like, okay, I get what's going on. I understand, this is clear, this is transparent. Like I know what I'm agreeing to. And so I think when you have a partner like that, that sort of recognizes that the intent is to make things easy and clear and help people understand what they're agreeing to, then it really helps.
That's it, because legal will definitely keep your feet to the fire in terms of that being specific and clear about the intent.
Yep.
Now, all of a sudden I'm curious. So the hyper localization, do you have like? I'm just trying to picture what level does that legal obligation go down to? Like, how localized does the language have to be to comply with local laws and regulations, for example?
Yeah, um I think a lot of it, especially with payments, is regulations are local, but we also often have very global policies in how we phrase certain things, or like how we want to position ourselves. So a lot of it is just making sure we're having the right conversations with people to be like, hey, we understand this is the guideline, this is the thing, but what's a good workaround here? Like, what do we do to make this more user friendly in this country? But also just sort of recognizing, like, hey, like, this is the brand we have, and this is how we want to position ourselves. So I think just going back to that eternal struggle as a content designer, it's always about like what the trade-off is, right? Like you want to make something user friendly. You also want to make sure you're sort of meeting all your internal guidelines. But yeah, we just have to have the discussion and see where it falls.
Yeah. You're reminding me, the friend who introduced us is Anna Potapova, the content designer at Alibaba Express. And she was talking about like when you're talking about that notion of globalization versus localization and kind of the specifics for the local environment, like there's in China versus like the West, there's this whole difference in like density of information and that kind of thing. And so adding it just as we're talking, it occurs to me like, okay, great, there's another dimension. You have those cultural things underneath it all, and then you have these very specific legal requirements, plus all the usual UX design stuff. How do you just mentioned that it's all about balancing those trade-offs. Can you give examples of like we were talking before we went on about like that language around debited and credited and
Yeah.
very specific financial language? Like how do you deal with that kind of, because legal probably says you have to use a word in this family or something. Tell me about how you reconcile that stuff.
I I actually have a very good example for that because I'm based in Singapore now. I'm Malaysian, but I'm based in Singapore. And the way we speak, I like to say that the way we speak is very economical. So, what's that character in The Office who says, why use many words when few words will do? So, something I realized when I first joined and when I was writing here based in Singapore was I would write something in one line. I would share it with a writer in the US, and they would be like, this just sounds really rude. It sounds really, it's very direct. It's very, there's no, I don't add the little like just and like also and like, all those little sort of like cushion words you use when you write. So yeah, I think like this felt very normal to me as someone who just, we're very used to using, being very economical with the way we speak. So that was an adjustment for me. And I think like just as I've been writing, going on and like writing, I've also just kind of noticed like how like in different markets, this economical sort of like way of speaking works. Like people just, especially in the UI, they just want to know where they are. They just want to be directed through the flow. Tell me what to do. And I did realize, in contrast, I think in some of the more American Western UX, for example, there was a lot of language around benefits. Like, yes, tell me what to do, but also make it compelling. Tell me why. Tell me why I should be doing these things. So, like this is probably a bad example, but it might be, for example, like, link your account to do this. And that might be just that sort of like direct way that I might write it here. Whereas I think some other place I might say like, hey, like do this better, to do whatever, it just this might help. So I think there's a bit of that nuance there as well, like just sort of like being more direct versus understanding that in some markets people just need to be guided a little bit more.
Yeah, that's really interesting, that notion that like, and it struck me as you were talking that there could be even more levels to that, like not just the tone, but also the amount of information that they expect in their cultural
Yep.
context. Like, just do this versus do this so you can, and do this so
Yep.
you can because that gives you these two benefits or whatever.
Yep.
Does your design work get that precise? Like, I'm trying to figure out how this is
It
ensconced in the
does.
code in a product. Yeah.
It does. And I think like especially here, maybe here in Asia, like in my previous company, I think like one thing we used to hear a lot from some of the folks we work with is like, stop having so much white space in your design. And I think if you just sort of browse some local Southeast Asian apps, or even other Asian apps here, you'll notice that that's pretty common. There isn't a lot of white space in apps. You'll also notice that I think maybe for someone who isn't used to the UX, that it feels pretty cluttered, because you might see, for example, even in like a sort of feed design where every single category is maybe organized in a different way. Like maybe some of these have squares, some of these have circles. There's a lot of like, it's very dynamic. The design is just, it's designed in a way where like each category feels distinct. It's designed in a way where, it makes it easy to scan and discover things. And I think sometimes in like Western UI, for example, a lot of the some of the UX is designed in a way where it's meant to be more of a feed style thing, right? Like it's a directory. You have a menu. You have like you know where everything is at a glance. Whereas I think here it's just like boom, everything's in your face, and we hope that the thing that matters the most to you will catch your attention because it's designed in a specific way. So yeah, there's definitely that nuance as well. I think you'll see a lot of like different shapes and stuff. One very interesting thing I saw recently, I think, with one of our East Asian markets was just even with the sort of like tone we used. So we saw, for example, that people recognized different types of content, and they wanted us to be using, again, like going back as a UX writer, one of the things that we keep in mind is like, hey, like keep your language consistent, keep your tone consistent, keep all that stuff consistent. But this was interesting to me because people wanted that variety in language. Things like benefits, like make this playful, make this sound a certain way, like it's okay to be a bit more conversational, it's okay to be a bit more cheeky. Whereas privacy language, no, just be serious. These are like terms and conditions. You have to use formal language. It's okay for things to be long. And having that variety in language was what made it easy to scan. So that's also interesting. I think like it's not common everywhere, but it is common here.
No, and that you're reminding me, you've mentioned a couple times getting into the mental model of your user and discerning that. And so some people expect and maybe even demand consistency, and others are like, no, if you're talking about this, talk about it that way. Again, what is the language like? You think of like the simplest thing I've seen in a lot of places, like you come up with the design and the flow and the language, and then you send it out for localization, and then you just put those different words in, or different, maybe slightly different screens. But this sounds like
Yeah.
more complex than that. How does that work sort of I don't know, like in the system or the technical implementation of it, that like okay, for this one you always use the same consistent layout, but here this category is organized this way and that category is organized that way.
Yeah, it's a very interesting challenge, and I think being a content designer in this part of the world is very unique. And it's precisely because of this, like because the design itself is so dynamic. I think you really, really need your content designer partnering with you from the start, right? Like because you might have like small chips or small cards, and like you want to mix and match all these different pieces, and the type of content you might put in each of these things is different. It's a little more difficult to write for dynamic design in this way compared to, for example, when you've got a single screen and all you have is like header, subheader, CTA, two CTA buttons. So a lot of the work we do comes in very early. I think there's a lot of back and forth with the designer being like, okay, do we have a card here? Do we have three cards here? Do we bold this? Do we, it all just comes into play because the way things look on the page matters just as much as like, the words themselves.
Again, back to the mental model. That's what they're expecting to see there.
Yeah.
As you're saying this, I'm wondering, have you experimented with like the guest just prior to this one on the show? One of the things we talked about was the new capabilities of AI to auto-generate layouts. To have like that's more like hyper personalization in general than hyper
Yeah.
localization. But it seems relevant here too. Or is that have you looked into that at all? Like, or is that on the table, that notion of sort of in some way automating or augmenting your work with AIs or other agents to do that kind of layout stuff or those variants?
I have not. I think it's interesting. Like, I definitely see potential there. I can't say that I've tried it personally. But, I'm also just thinking about how it, like, just the fact that, a lot of this sort of like organization, like, hey, like, should we use a card? Should we use this? Like, there's definitely, a world where you could set different rules for when you use different parts of this, and all this stuff is so complex, right? And so I can see a world where, like with like enough guardrails, you could be like, hey, like, what's the right way to organize all these different components and like icons and like strings, and have something that's compelling based on all that. So yeah, I think that might be interesting, especially in this place where everything sort of needs to come together.
Yeah. Well, and maybe I'm overthinking it too. Maybe it's just like more sophisticated design system. Because you all have a pretty famous design system at Google.
We do.
Is it pretty extensible in the sense that like when you get to an edge case like this, you're like, no, we don't use the same layout in those
Yeah,
similar looking sections.
it definitely is, and I think like I feel like I'm lucky enough that I work on a team that gets to do pretty hyper local stuff, even though we're at a big company like Google. So, it's nice to maybe have the best of both worlds. You have the design system, but you also think about what makes sense. We were talking a little bit earlier about the extent of hyper localization, and it's definitely different how far you go sometimes with these things. Like, I imagine if I were at a company that was primarily in Singapore, and my audience was just that, like, I'm only writing for this one market. Like, my how far I might go, I might be a lot more Singaporean in how I write. Whereas I think like if you're a more global brand, like you might want to introduce like smaller nuances like here and there where it feels like it resonates, like small touches here and there where you're like, okay, I get it. Like, this small thing felt Singaporean, but if I were not Singaporean, I might not notice it. So yeah, I think like there's a bit of that balance as well. But there are also places where it feels like it really makes sense, and so we push a little bit more.
That example of the Singapore, like having that kind of gets into we talked a little bit earlier about tone, but there's also the voice of the brand and the product. And that kind of gets into that. It's like, no, we're Singapore based and we use local slang or whatever that
Yeah.
implies.
Yeah.
But that again, that kind of gets more into like like product decision making about like
Yep.
or branding even like about how you're going to talk. Does or I guess maybe can you talk maybe I don't know generally about how voice and tone manifest and how they work together in hyper localized work?
Yeah. I think like I like so my like my favorite example to use when just talking about hyper like localization honestly is McDonald's. I think McDonald's does such a great job with hyper localization, right? Because like I'm here, so I'm on holiday in Malaysia right now, which is where I'm from, and you can get fried chicken with rice from McDonald's here. It's like nasi lemak, which is like a local dish here, and but it feels like McDonald's, right? Because the fried chicken is McDonald's, and that's their brand. So I think like when we think about hyper localization, especially when you're a big brand, it's you want to make sure that your voice and tone and like all the core components still feel like the brand, but you also want to look for areas where like, hey, if you did one or two things, it would resonate locally.
Interesting. And that's a classic because I've traveled enough to have seen. I don't go to McDonald's a lot, but every once in a while I'll stick my head in just to see what the local variant is. And that's really interesting. Do they still have burgers and fries, or is it all local cuisine?
Yeah, yeah, it's funny. Like, I came here yesterday and they had like a spicy chili burger. So that
Hmm.
was
I'm
interesting.
trying, and I'm trying to picture now analogies in set like a digital SaaS product, like like the
Yep.
what the and again a lot of what we've talked about is like how you present it, but like how the product might are there situations like again my mind is kind of reeling it like you got all these lawyers saying nope you got to do this, and you have product people who have uh, ideas and brand people, and then
Yeah.
all these people with their individual mental models whom you're serving. It just it's fascinating. Like how close do you think you're getting? I guess that's the idea. When I first heard about hyper localization, I'm like, are we talking about individuals or cohorts or communities? Like how what level do you think we're at right now in terms of how precisely you can hyper localize content for folks?
I think, there's always going to be a push and pull, especially with sort of like legally mandated content. One maybe example I've also had from a while back is especially when you have controls, right? Like you have consent and you have all these controls. There's sometimes a very specific way someone might have the specific wording someone might have used for how that control is positioned. And because it's legal language, because you want to make sure people understand what they're consenting to, there might be a requirement that, hey, we have to use this very specific language anytime we talk about this very specific control. But sometimes, it so happens you might use a word that feels a bit complicated, like without going into specifics. I don't know. So maybe you're using the word authentication or using the word personalization, and these feel like big words for some people. So there might be areas sometimes where sometimes it's hard to make that change. Sometimes you also look at like what's the spirit of this content? Like, is there a different way of phrasing this where we still sort of like match the intent of what this is supposed to mean? So yeah, I think like there are a lot of like conversations we have around these things, especially with like legalese. But yeah, we definitely have issues like that where we're stuck sometimes with words that might not translate as well.
Hmm. You're reminding me, I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago where a really brilliant keynote speaker talked about in terms of like consent and when you agree to terms of service, he talked about like basically how kind of inane it was to make a lot of assumptions based on what he called the brief explosion of trust. Excuse me. Does that make sense? Is that something you wrestle with that?
I feel like I have a lot of controversial takes about privacy,
Hmm.
language especially. Like I know like we have there are definitely a lot of like patterns that have become common with privacy, and sometimes you see them so often that people almost develop like a kind of blindness towards it, right? Like you see it so often that you're like, okay, I'm just gonna tap through and like because I assume I know what this is. So I've seen stuff like that. I think one very interesting example recently, I think we had an English version which we might have been testing. We wrote different versions of this English version, and most people were like, you know what, like it doesn't matter how you write there. Nobody reads all this stuff. Just, I'm just gonna tap through. We happened to show some people the same version of this in a local language. And then, people saw it and they were like, oh my God, I actually understand what this means. All right, maybe I might not do this. So I think it's interesting that sometimes, like, we've developed patterns for these things. And so people just are like, yeah, I saw this system dialogue. Anytime I see a system dialogue, this is what I'm supposed to do. Nobody reads all this stuff. But then, when you draw a bit more attention to it, then they're like, oh, wait, okay, right. Like, this is what it actually means. This is what it actually says. So, yeah, I think like same thing with the pattern stuff, right? Like sometimes something becomes so common that you just sort of like run through it because that's what you think you're supposed to do. And sometimes just switching things up actually helps.
That you're reminding me of like we're all striving to create these friction-free experiences, and every once in a while, especially in terms of consent or financial obligations, you might want to have a little bit more friction in there.
Yeah.
Hey, Stephanie, I can't believe it. We're coming up close to time, but before we wrap up, is there anything you want to revisit from the conversation, or just anything you want to make sure we share before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we first started talking about this, I was giving this example of how, when I was growing up, my family is mostly made up of teachers, and I grew up in Malaysia, but I spoke a lot of English at home. But I would speak Malayalam, which is my mother tongue, to my grandmother, who would, I would speak English to her, and she would speak Malayalam back to me. And I think that definitely, I wouldn't speak the same English to her that I would speak to my parents. I wouldn't speak the same type of English to her that I would speak to my friends. A lot of I spoke very simple English to her, and I only realized much later that she was also speaking very when you're writing even in the same language, like even writing in English, like different people experience English in different ways. It's the same thing as like, if you're writing in Portuguese or some other language in countries, like different people are going to understand that language in a different way. And so one, it's always helpful not to make assumptions like, hey, everyone speaks English, and so we're all going to understand it in a certain way. I think the other thing also, just sort of like talking about McDonald's and the local experience, was sometimes just having these very, very small local touches just really help make people feel like, you know what, someone here cares about making this brand feel local. And these little touches really, really help so much.
Interesting. So there's a lot of talk in our world about baby steps, and maybe that's a good baby step in terms of localization content practice. Is just whatever little to demonstrate that you care, even the slightest bit can help. Fantastic.
Yes. Yeah.
Hey, one very last thing, Stephanie. If folks want to connect with you or follow you online, what's the best place to find you?
LinkedIn.
LinkedIn. Okay, it's always the answer now. Well, thanks so much for taking time out of your day, Stephanie. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.